Some men don't die from bullets. They die from the quiet, from the things they should have screamed, from the roads they should have taken. They die from standing by and doing nothing. Will Morgan felt that kind of death creeping in for years. It was a cold rust on the inside of him, ever since he buried his wife Martha behind the barn. The world hadn't bothered to check if he was still breathing. It just spun on, leaving him with nothing but dust, fences, and the ghosts of conversations he never finished. That morning was supposed to be like any other. Sun cracking over the dry hills, the familiar creak of saddle leather, another broken fence post on the south ridge. Just another day to get through, until he saw the sack. It was hanging from a low, twisted branch of a cottonwood tree, swinging just enough in the breeze to catch the eye. It was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. It wasn't tied right, more like it was thrown in a hurry, snagged by accident. It was old burlap, stained, dark with things he didn't want to name. Any smart man would have turned his horse around right then and there. Trouble doesn't send an invitation. It just shows up at your door. But Will wasn't a smart man anymore. He was just an empty one. He rode closer, his hand resting near the butt of his pistol. The air was dead still, except for the lazy swing of the sack. No birds singing, no coyotes howling in the distance. Just silence. And that's when he heard it. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a cry. It was smaller than that. A desperate, hitched breath. A human sound. A sound that had no business being out here. Dangling from a tree. He swung himself off his horse, boots landing soft in the dust. Every instinct, every nerve that had kept him alive this long was screaming at him to leave. To ride away and forget he ever saw it. But he remembered Martha's last words. Don't let the quiet take you, Will. He reached up, his fingers brushing against the rough fabric. The sack shifted. It was heavier than it looked. He pulled at the knot, his knuckles raw. It wouldn't give. He drew his knife, the steel whispering as he sliced through the rope. The sack fell to the ground with a heavy, sickening thud. He knelt, pulling the burlap open. And the world stopped. Inside was a woman, maybe 25, though it was hard to tell. Her dress was ripped to shreds. Her skin was a road map of bruises and blisters from the sun. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, and one of her wrists was still bound with a loop of rusted baling wire. She wasn't fighting. She wasn't even crying. Her eyes, a startling, defiant blue, locked onto his. They were empty of fear, empty of hope, empty of everything. She spoke, her voice a dry rasp, like sand scraping over stone. Just kill me fast. Will froze, the knife still in his hand. The words hit him harder than a punch. Not a plea for help, not a cry for a savior, a request for an ending. He'd seen men break in the war, seen them beg for their lives. He'd never seen anyone beg for the opposite. He tucked the knife away and gently pulled back the thin, dirty blanket that was half covering her. And what he saw made his stomach turn inside out. It wasn't just the bruises or the cuts. It was something else. Burned into the skin of her inner arm was a mark, a crude, ugly brand, like you'd see on cattle. It was a snake coiled around a dagger, forming 3 letters. JKS. He'd seen that mark once before, years ago on a dead man floating in a river down near the border. A man the law said had just had a bad run of luck. But this wasn't luck. This was a signature. Whoever did this didn't just want her to die. They wanted her to be found. They wanted their work to be seen. This wasn't just violence. This was a message. And he had a terrible feeling he knew who it was for. The ranch wasn't a palace. It was a collection of faded wood and stubborn nails holding on against the wind. The porch roof groaned every time a storm rolled in, and the chairs out front were mostly for show. No one ever visited, but for the woman, it was a fortress. Will carried her inside, her body weighing almost nothing in his arms. He laid her on his own bed, the one that had been cold for 3 years. She didn't fight him, but she didn't relax either. Her whole body was coiled tight, like a spring ready to snap. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask who JKS was. He just brought her a bowl of lukewarm water and a clean rag. He left it on the nightstand and walked out, closing the door softly behind him. Maybe that's why she stayed, because the questions he didn't ask were louder than the ones anyone else would have. She didn't sleep in the bed. The next morning, he found her curled on the floor, wrapped in the blanket, tucked into the small space between the wood stove and the wall. Like an animal seeking shelter, afraid of open spaces, afraid the comfort of a mattress was a trick. She flinched every time the floorboards creaked. Her eyes darted to the door any time a shadow passed the window. She was a ghost in his house, a whisper of a person who had seen too much. For 3 days she said nothing. He would leave food and water by the stove, and when he came back, the plate would be empty, but he never saw her eat. It was like she only existed when he wasn't looking. He just went about his work, fixing the fences, mucking out the stalls. The rhythmic, mindless work kept his own ghosts at bay. It was a routine. And maybe for her, that routine was the only thing that made sense in a world that had tried to tear her apart. The quiet between them wasn't empty. It was a language of its own. It said, "I won't hurt you. I won't ask. You are safe here." On the fourth morning, he was outside splitting firewood. The solid thunk of the axe was a familiar beat. He felt her presence before he saw her. She was standing on the porch, wrapped in one of his old shirts that swallowed her whole. Her hair was pulled back with a piece of twine. Her shoulders were straight, but it looked like it took every ounce of her strength to keep them that way. She just watched him. The axe rose and fell, splitting log after log. The sun beat down. Sweat dripped from his brow. Then she walked down the steps. She didn't say a word. She just reached for a log, her hands still raw and bruised, and placed it on the chopping block for him. He paused, axe in midair. He looked at her. She met his gaze. That same defiant blue, but this time there was something else in it. A flicker. He brought the axe down. Thunk. She placed another log on the block. Thunk. They worked like that for an hour in perfect unspoken rhythm. Two broken people who had forgotten how to speak, finding a way to communicate in the simplest of actions. Later that night, as they sat by the fire, she finally spoke. Her voice was still a whisper, but it was clear. "You didn't touch me." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a fact she had observed and weighed. Will just looked at the fire, the flames dancing in his tired eyes. "No reason to." She nodded, a single sharp movement. And for the first time since he'd found her, she ate while he was in the room. She finished every last bite of the stew he'd made. And then she did something that shocked him more than anything else. She smiled. It wasn't a big smile. It was small, fragile, like a wildflower pushing its way through cracked earth. But it was real. And in that moment, Will felt a part of that cold rust inside him flake away. Now, if this story ended there, you might think it's about healing, about a good man finding a second chance by giving one to someone else. But healing is a fairy tale. The real world has monsters, and those monsters always come back to finish the job. The very next morning, the real story began. The quiet never lasts. Out here is just the breath the world takes before it screams. It started with hoof prints. Will saw them at dawn, down by the creek bed on the northern edge of his property. 3 horses, shod with steel shoes he didn't recognize. They'd ridden along his fence line, slow and deliberate, surveying. They weren't local. The shoes were worn in a way that spoke of long, hard riding over rocky terrain, not the soft dirt of the valley. He didn't say a word to her. He didn't want that fragile smile to disappear. He just cleaned his rifle, oiled the action until it was smooth as silk, and spent the rest of the day riding the perimeter of his land. He wasn't just a rancher anymore. He was a sentry. That night, she didn't curl up by the stove. She sat in the chair opposite him, a blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, watching the fire. "Something's wrong," she said, her voice barely audible. "I can feel it. The air is different." He just nodded. "Storm's coming." But they both knew he wasn't talking about the weather. The next day he found it, draped over his front gate, a clear and brutal message. It was a dead raven, its wings spread and nailed to the wood. In its beak was a single, withered wildflower, the same kind that grew behind his barn, right over Martha's grave. His blood ran cold. This wasn't just a warning, this was personal. They hadn't just followed the woman here. They knew who he was. They knew what he had lost. He tore the bird down, his hands shaking with a rage he hadn't felt in years. He buried it out back, far from the house, far from her view. but he couldn't bury the meaning. We can touch what you love. That night she came to him while he was cleaning his pistol at the kitchen table. The lamplight cast long shadows across the room. "They're coming for me," she said. It wasn't a question. He didn't look up from his work. "Let 'em come." She shook her head, a violent, sudden motion. "You don't understand who they are. You don't know what JKS means." She held out her arm, the branded skin a dark scar in the dim light. "It doesn't stand for a name," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's not one man. It's a promise. Just keep suffering." Will finally looked up, his knuckles white around the grip of his pistol. "They don't just kill you," she said, tears finally welling in her eyes. "They take everything from you first. They make you watch it all burn. And when you have nothing left, when you are nothing but an empty shell, they leave you in the dark. That's their trade." He felt that cold silence he knew so well trying to swallow him again. But this time, something else was there with it. A burning, white-hot fury. He stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. He walked to the window and stared out into the oppressive darkness. "They already took everything from me once," he said, his voice low and hard as granite. "They're not getting a second chance." He turned back to her, his face set. And that's when he knew. This wasn't her fight anymore. It was his. He rode for Tombstone at first light. Not for the sheriff. He knew better than that. Men like JKS didn't operate in a vacuum. They thrived in the shadows cast by so-called good men who looked the other way. No, he was looking for information. For a whisper, a rumor, anything that could give him an edge. He tied his horse outside the saloon, the same place he hadn't set foot in since Martha died. The place smelled of stale beer and desperation. He ordered a whiskey, letting it sit untouched on the bar as he listened. The talk was all about the railroad coming through, about land prices, about a cattle baron from out east named Jericho Killian Slade, who was buying up every failing ranch in the county for pennies on the dollar. A real generous man, they said. A pillar of the community. Will felt a knot tighten in his gut. Jericho Killian Slade. JKS. He listened for hours as drifters and ranch hands talked. They spoke of Slade's enforcers, men who were more like wolves than humans. Men who collected debts and settled disputes with a quiet, brutal efficiency. They spoke of people who had stood up to Slade, ranchers who refused to sell. Funny thing, though. Every single one of them had met with some kind of tragedy, a barn fire, a well gone dry, a sudden disappearance. Bad luck, everyone called it. Will knew it wasn't luck. It was a trade. As he was about to leave, a haggard old prospector stumbled in, his eyes wide with fear. He was rambling, half drunk, half terrified. He was talking about his partner, a man named Jed. They'd been working a claim up in the Dragoon Mountains, on land that bordered Slade's new territory. Jed had found something, the old man slurred, something that wasn't gold. He said Jed found a cave, and inside were things no man should see. Cages, chains bolted to the wall, and a ledger. A big leather-bound book filled with names and numbers. Jed had taken the book, thinking it was valuable. That was a week ago. No one had seen Jed since. The bartender told the old man to shut his mouth before he got them all killed. The prospector just shook his head, muttering that Jed had a key, a special iron key he always wore around his neck. Said it was the only thing that could open the ledger. Will's blood turned to ice. He thought of the woman back at his ranch. He thought of the way she had slept that first night, curled up like an animal, the way she flinched at every sound. And he thought of something else, something he dismissed at the time. The first morning when he'd gone in to check on her, something had fallen from the folds of her blanket onto the floor. He'd picked it up and put it on the nightstand, thinking it was just a piece of junk. A small, intricately carved iron key. He threw a coin on the bar and walked out, his mind racing. This changed everything. She wasn't just a victim who had escaped. She was something more. She hadn't just been running from them. She had been running with something of theirs. And now he knew exactly what it was. The ride back to the ranch felt like an eternity. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. The key, the ledger, JKS. It was all a tangled knot, and she was right in the middle of it. Was she a victim, or was she a thief? Did it matter? He found her in the barn, gently brushing one of the horses. The animal, usually skittish around strangers, was perfectly calm, nuzzling her hand. There was a quiet strength in her he hadn't seen before. He walked up to her, his boots echoing in the cavernous space. He didn't say a word. He just opened his hand. In his palm lay the small iron key. Her eyes widened. The color drained from her face. She looked from the key to his eyes, and he saw a flicker of the same fear she'd had when he first found her. The fear of being discovered. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. "It fell out of your blanket that first day," he said, his voice flat. An old prospector in town was talking. About his missing partner. About a ledger. About this key. He let the words hang in the air between them. She closed her eyes, her shoulders slumping. The tough exterior she had built over the last few days crumbled, and for a moment she just looked like a lost girl. "My name is Alara," she said finally, her voice thick with unshed tears. "And I wasn't just his victim. I was his bookkeeper." The confession hit Will like a physical blow. Jericho Killian Slade, the generous cattle baron, the pillar of the community. "I kept his books," she continued, her voice gaining a hard edge. "I recorded every land deal made with a threat, every rancher who was burned out, every person who disappeared. It's all in there, names, dates, payments, the sheriff, the judge, all of them." She looked him straight in the eye, her own gaze burning with a self-loathing that was painful to watch. "I did it because I was a coward," she said. "He found me when I had nothing, and he offered me a choice. Work for him or be one of the names in the book. I chose to live, but I couldn't. I couldn't keep doing it." Jedediah, the prospector. He was a good man. He found the ledger where I'd hidden it. I helped him run, but they caught him. I barely got away. I took the key thinking I could expose them all. She let out a bitter laugh. "But I was a fool. There's no one to show it to. They own this whole territory, the law, the courts, everything. That book isn't a key to justice. It's a map of their empire. And this," she held up the key, "this is my death sentence." So that was it. The whole rotten truth. He wasn't sheltering an innocent victim. He was harboring the one person who could bring the whole corrupt system crashing down. The one witness they couldn't afford to leave alive. The hoof prints, the dead raven. It all made sense now. They weren't just hunting her. They were hunting the evidence. And she had led them right to his door. "Where is the ledger now?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. She shook her head. "I don't know. Jed had it when they took him. It's gone. For all I know, they have it back." But Will knew better. If they had the ledger, she'd be dead already. They wouldn't be leaving warnings. They'd have burned his ranch to the ground. They were still looking, which meant the ledger was still out there. And that's when he saw it, the flicker of a lie in her eyes. It was fast, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She was still holding something back. He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her. "Don't lie to me, Alara," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "Not now. Where is it?" She hesitated, her jaw tight. Then she let out a shaky breath. "Jed was smart," she said. "He knew they'd come for him. He told me if anything happened, he'd hide it in the last place they would ever think to look. A place they thought they owned. A place they saw every single day." She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a terrifying, desperate gamble. "It's in Tombstone," she whispered, "hidden under a loose floorboard, in the sheriff's own office." The plan was insane. It was a suicide mission dressed up as a long shot, walking into the lion's den to steal from the lion himself. But it was the only plan they had. They couldn't both go. Someone had to stay at the ranch to make it look like everything was normal. If Slade's men came by and found the place empty, they'd know something was up. Alara insisted she be the one to go. She knew the office. She knew the town. But Will wouldn't hear of it. He saw the tremor in her hands, the fear that still clung to her like a shroud. Sending her back there would be a cruelty worse than anything Slade could do. "You stay," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Keep the doors locked. Keep the rifle close. If you see anyone, you don't hide. You shoot." He prepared to leave under the cover of darkness. He packed light. His pistol, a hunting knife, a length of rope, and a small flask of whiskey. As he was about to mount his horse, Ilara ran out of the house. She grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Will, wait!" In her other hand, she held a piece of paper. It was a drawing, hastily sketched in charcoal from the fireplace. It was a map of the sheriff's office. "The loose board is here," she said, pointing to a spot right behind the pot-bellied stove. "You'll have to move it. It's heavy. The board is marked with a small star carved into the wood. You'll only see it if you're looking for it." He took the map, his fingers brushing hers. For a second their eyes met, and in that moment an unspoken understanding passed between them. This wasn't just about the ledger anymore. This was about trust. "Be careful, Will," she whispered. He just nodded, swung himself into the saddle, and disappeared into the night. The ride to Tombstone was tense. Every rustle in the brush, every hoot of an owl, set his teeth on edge. He wasn't a young man anymore. The fire that had driven him in his youth had long since cooled to embers. But tonight, that fire was roaring back to life. He skirted the main road, sticking to the shadows of the canyons. He tethered his horse in a gully a mile outside of town and made his way in on foot, moving like a phantom through the back alleys. Tombstone was asleep, save for the faint sound of a piano and drunken laughter spilling from the saloon. The sheriff's office was dark, a squat, imposing building at the end of the main street. He circled it twice, checking the windows, the doors. There was a single deputy sleeping in a chair out front, tilted back, his hat over his eyes. Getting in the front was impossible, but Ilara had told him about the back window, the one with the broken latch. He moved silently, slipping into the narrow alley behind the building. The window was stiff, but with a bit of pressure from his knife, it slid open with a low groan. He held his breath, listening. The deputy didn't stir. He slipped inside, landing silently on the dusty floor. The office smelled of stale cigar smoke and cheap whiskey. Moonlight streamed through the front window, illuminating the room in a ghostly silver light. He could see the pot-bellied stove, just like on the map. He crept forward, every nerve screaming. The floorboards groaned under his weight. He froze, listening. Nothing. He knelt behind the stove, the metal still faintly warm. He ran his hands over the rough-hewn floorboards, searching for the mark. His fingers brushed over splintered wood, knots, and then he felt it. A small, five-pointed star, crudely carved. He slid his knife into the crack and pried. The board resisted. He put more force into it, his muscles straining. It gave way with a low, agonizing creak. He reached into the dark space beneath. His fingers closed around something solid, wrapped in oilcloth. The ledger. He had it. A wave of relief washed over him. He pulled it out, a thick, heavy book. He was just about to slide the floorboard back into place when he heard it, a floorboard creaking. Right outside the office door. He flattened himself to the floor behind the desk, his heart hammering against his ribs. He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer cocking, sounding like a cannon shot in the silent room. The front door opened. A figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the moonlight. It wasn't the deputy. This man was tall, dressed in a long, dark coat. The man lit a match, the sudden flare illuminating his face. It was the sheriff, but he wasn't alone. A second man stepped in behind him, his face scarred, his eyes cold and empty. Will recognized him from the saloon gossip. This was Caleb, Slade's top enforcer. "He's not here," the sheriff grumbled, looking around the empty office. "I told you your source was wrong." Caleb didn't answer. He just sniffed the air, like a predator catching a scent. "Someone's been in here. I smell sweat and fear." His eyes scanned the room, lingering on the pot-bellied stove. He took a step forward, and then another. He was walking directly towards the desk where Will was hiding. Will's mind raced. He was trapped. One wrong move, one deep breath, and it was over. Caleb stopped right in front of the desk, so close Will could have reached out and touched his boots. He held his breath, the pistol heavy and cold in his hand. "Check behind the stove," Caleb said, his voice a low growl. "That girl, Ilara, she was clever, always hiding things in plain sight." The sheriff grunted and lumbered over to the stove. Will watched in horror as he knelt down, his eyes scanning the floorboards. Any second now he would see the one that was out of place. "Nothing here," the sheriff said, sounding impatient. But Caleb didn't move. He just stood there, his cold gaze sweeping across the room. His eyes fell on the back window, the one Will had left slightly ajar. "No," Caleb said softly, "but someone was, and they left in a hurry." He started walking towards the window. This was it, his only chance. As Caleb passed the desk, Will exploded into motion. He lunged out, not with the gun, but with his shoulder, crashing into the back of Caleb's knees. The big man went down with a surprised grunt, his head cracking against the floor. Will didn't wait to see if he was out. He scrambled to his feet, the ledger clutched under one arm, and vaulted over the desk. The sheriff, clumsy and slow, was just turning around, fumbling for his gun. Will didn't hesitate. He fired one shot, not at the sheriff, but at the big oil lamp hanging from the ceiling. Glass shattered. Oil and flame rained down, instantly igniting the dry wooden floor and a stack of papers on the desk. The room erupted in a whoosh of fire and smoke. The sheriff screamed, swatting at the flames that had caught on his sleeve. Will used the chaos. He kicked open the front door and sprinted out into the street, the sleeping deputy jolting awake in a panic. "Fire! Fire!" Will yelled at the top of his lungs, not stopping for a second. He didn't look back. He just ran, melting back into the alleys he had come from, the shouts and chaos of the waking town fading behind him. He could hear the crackle of the flames, the town's fire bell starting to ring. He ran until his lungs burned, until he reached the gully where his horse was waiting. He swung himself into the saddle, the ledger tucked safely into his saddlebag, and spurred the horse into a gallop. He didn't slow down until the glow of the fire in Tombstone was just a faint orange smudge on the horizon. He had the book. He had started a war. And now the real battle was about to begin. He rode into the ranch yard just as the first hint of dawn was painting the eastern sky. The house was dark and quiet. Too quiet. A cold dread washed over him. He dismounted, his pistol in his hand, and crept toward the house. The front door was slightly ajar. "Alara?" he called out, his voice low. No answer. He pushed the door open. The main room was a wreck. The table was overturned, chairs were smashed, a lamp lay shattered on the floor, its oil staining the wood. There were signs of a struggle, and Alara was gone. His heart sank. He had been a fool. He had left her alone, vulnerable. While he was playing hero in Tombstone, Slade's men had come for her. He scanned the room, his eyes searching for any clue, any sign of where they might have taken her. And then he saw it. On the floor near the overturned table lay a single, dead wildflower, the same kind they had left on his gate, the same kind that grew over Martha's grave. But there was something else. Next to the flower, traced in the spilled lamp oil on the floor, was a single letter, a hastily drawn C. C. What did it mean? A name? A place? He thought back to the prospector's story, the cave, Jedediah's claim. He remembered the old man saying it was up in the Dragoon Mountains, near a place called Copper Canyon. C for canyon. It was a long shot, a desperate guess, but it was the only thing he had. He didn't rest. He didn't even stop for water. He grabbed a box of cartridges, his rifle, and stuffed the ledger deep into his saddlebag. He was going to get her back. He rode hard, pushing his horse to its limit. The sun rose higher, beating down on him mercilessly. The land grew harsher, the soft dirt of the valley giving way to the jagged rocks and canyons of the mountains. He found the trail easily enough. 3 horses just like before. They weren't trying to hide their tracks. They were confident, arrogant. They didn't think anyone would be stupid enough to follow. The tracks led him deep into the mountains, up a narrow winding path that overlooked a steep drop. The air grew thin and cold. As dusk began to settle, he saw it. A faint flicker of firelight ahead, nestled in a small, hidden basin. He dismounted, tying his horse to a scrub pine, and continued on foot, his rifle in his hands. He crept to the edge of the basin and looked down. There was a rough-looking camp, a fire pit, a few bedrolls, and 3 men. One of them was Caleb, his head bandaged. The other 2 were just as mean-looking. And tied to a tree, her face bruised and defiant, was Alara. They were waiting. Not for him. They were waiting for Slade. They had the prize, and now they were waiting for the master to come and claim it. Will's blood boiled, but he knew he couldn't rush in. 3 of them, 1 of him. The odds were bad. He needed a plan. He looked around the basin, his eyes scanning the terrain. The camp was set against the mouth of a dark cave, Jedediah's cave, and above the cave, perched precariously on a high ledge, was a pile of loose rocks and scree. A small man-made rock slide waiting to happen. An idea, desperate and dangerous, began to form in his mind. He checked his rifle. He had 6 shots. He was going to have to make every single one of them count. He worked his way around the basin, staying in the shadows, moving with the patience of a hunter. The men below were drinking, laughing. They thought they had won. He positioned himself on a ridge directly opposite the unstable rock slide, giving him a clear line of sight into the camp. He rested his rifle on a rock, taking careful aim. Not at the men, at the small pile of rocks holding the larger slide in place. He took a deep breath, let it out slow, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked, the sound echoing through the canyon like a thunderclap. The bullet sparked against the rock he was aiming for. It was enough. A few pebbles shifted, then a few larger rocks, and then the entire ledge gave way. With a deafening roar, tons of rock and dirt cascaded down into the basin. It didn't hit the camp directly, but it was close enough. It crashed down right in front of the cave, sending a massive cloud of dust and debris everywhere, completely blocking the entrance. The men jumped to their feet, startled and confused, their guns drawn. "What in the hell was that?" one of them yelled. In that moment of chaos, Will fired again. His second shot took out the man closest to Alara. The man crumpled to the ground without a sound. The other 2, Caleb and the third man, dove for cover, firing blindly into the darkness. Will didn't stay put. He moved, scrambling down the ridge, using the dust and the fading light as cover. He needed to get closer. He found a new position behind a cluster of boulders, closer to the camp. He could see Caleb yelling, trying to organize a defense. The third man was reloading, his back to Will. Will fired his third shot. The man went down. Now it was just him and Caleb. "Morgan!" Caleb roared into the darkness, his voice filled with fury. "I know it's you. You're a dead man." Will stayed silent. Let him guess. Let him waste his bullets. He could see Alara, still tied to the tree. She was struggling against her ropes, her eyes wide, searching the shadows for him. Caleb started moving, creeping from one piece of cover to the next, trying to circle around and find Will's position. He was smart, a seasoned predator, but Will had the ledger. He had the high ground, and he had a reason to fight that went beyond money or power. He saw Caleb's shadow move behind a large rock, not 50 feet from him. Will raised his rifle, waiting. He knew Caleb would have to show himself to get a clear shot. Seconds ticked by, feeling like hours. Then Caleb lunged out, his pistol barking. The shot went wide, kicking up dirt near Will's head. But Will was ready. His fourth shot was true. The bullet caught Caleb in the shoulder, spinning him around. He cried out in pain, dropping his gun. Will stood up, rifle aimed at Caleb's chest. It was over. He walked slowly into the camp, the silence of the canyon broken only by Caleb's pained breathing. He didn't look at Caleb. His eyes were on Alara. He went to her and cut her ropes with his knife. She stumbled into his arms, bearing her face in his chest, her body shaking with sobs of relief. He held her for a moment, the warmth of her a stark contrast to the cold business he still had to finish. He pushed her gently behind him. "Stay here." He walked over to where Caleb was kneeling on the ground, clutching his shoulder. "Where is Slade?" Will asked, his voice cold. Caleb just spat a mouthful of blood onto the ground and laughed, a ragged, painful sound. "He's coming, Morgan," he rasped. "He's coming with all his men. You think you won? You've just rung the dinner bell. You and the girl are dead." And that's when Will heard it, the sound of horses, not 1 or 2, a dozen, maybe more, coming up the canyon trail, fast. Caleb's smile widened. "Too late, old man." Will looked from the approaching sound to the blocked cave entrance. He was trapped in the basin, outnumbered, outgunned. He had won the battle, but he was about to lose the war. Panic flared in his chest, hot and sharp. He looked at Alara. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with the same terror he felt. This was it, the end of the line. But then he looked at the cave. The entrance was blocked, but the blast had also done something else. It had knocked loose a section of rock near the top of the debris pile, creating a small, dark opening, a crawl space. "The cave," he said, grabbing Alara's arm. "Now!" He half dragged, half pushed her toward the rock slide. The sound of hoofbeats was getting louder, closer. They were almost here. "I can't," she cried, looking at the tiny opening. "It's too small." "You can," he said, his voice hard. "Get in. I'll be right behind you." He gave her a final push, and she scrambled up the rocks, squeezing through the narrow gap and disappearing into the darkness. He turned to face the trail, his rifle at his shoulder. He could see them now, dark shapes in the moonlight, pouring into the basin. Leading them was a man on a magnificent black horse, a man who sat in the saddle like he was born to it. Jericho Killian Slade. Will fired his fifth shot. One of the riders screamed and fell from his horse. He fired his last shot. Another rider went down. Then he threw the empty rifle aside, drew his pistol, and scrambled up the rocks after Alara, bullets whining past his head, chipping stone from the rock face. He squeezed through the opening just as Slade and his men reached the rock slide. He could hear them yelling, cursing. He was inside. They were safe. For now. He turned, his eyes adjusting to the pitch black of the cave. Alara was a few feet away, her breathing ragged. "Will?" she whispered. "I'm here," he said, finding her hand in the dark. They were in a narrow tunnel. The air was cold and damp, smelling of earth and stone. They could hear Slade's men outside, shouting, trying to clear the rocks. "They'll dig their way in," Alara said, her voice trembling. "We're trapped." "No," Will said, his voice grim. Jedediah was a prospector. This isn't just a cave. It's the start of his mine. There has to be another way out. An air shaft, a back entrance. He lit a match. The small flame flickered, casting dancing shadows on the rock walls. They were in a man-made tunnel, reinforced with rotting wooden beams. It led deeper into the mountain. They started walking, the sounds of the men outside growing fainter. They used the matches sparingly, plunging themselves into darkness for long stretches, feeling their way along the cold, damp walls. The tunnel twisted and turned. Several times it branched off into smaller dead-end shafts. The hope that had flared within him began to dim. Maybe Alara was right. Maybe they had just traded one trap for another. After what felt like hours, the tunnel opened up into a large, natural cavern. In the center of the cavern, illuminated by a faint sliver of moonlight from a crack in the ceiling far above, were the things the old prospector had described. Cages, rusted chains bolted to the walls, and a scattering of bones. This was Slade's secret prison, his disposal site for anyone who stood in his way. Alara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. But Will was looking at something else. On the far side of the cavern, there was another tunnel, and from that tunnel, he could feel a faint but distinct breeze. An exit. They ran towards it, stumbling over loose rocks. The tunnel was steep, leading upwards. The breeze grew stronger. They could smell pine needles and clean, cold night air. They emerged from the mountainside, gasping, into a thick forest of pine trees. They were on the other side of the ridge. They were free. They didn't stop. They kept moving, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the cave. They were on foot, exhausted, with no food or water. Slade and his men were on horseback. They were free, but they were also being hunted, and they still had the ledger, the one piece of evidence that could burn Slade's empire to the ground, the one thing he would kill them both to get back. The escape wasn't an ending. It was just the beginning of the chase. For 2 days they were ghosts. They moved by night and hid by day, surviving on wild berries and the cold, clear water from mountain streams. Will's tracking skills, learned over a lifetime spent in the wilderness, kept them one step ahead of Slade's men. They saw the search parties, heard their calls echoing through the canyons, but they were never found. They were alive, but they were running out of time. They couldn't run forever. On the third night, huddled under a rocky overhang as a cold rain fell, Alara turned to him. The fire was gone from her eyes, replaced by a weary resignation. We have to get rid of it, she said, nodding toward the saddlebag where he kept the ledger. Throw it down a crevasse. Burn it. As long as we have it, he will never stop. No, Will said, his jaw set. We're not running anymore. We're fighting. How, Will? She asked, her voice breaking. Look at us. We have nothing. He has everything. He has the law, the guns, the money. What do we have? Will looked at the ledger. He thought of the names inside, the ranchers who had lost everything, the people who had disappeared. He thought of Martha and the quiet that had almost consumed him. We have the truth, he said, and sometimes that's enough. He had a new plan. It was even crazier than the last one. They couldn't go to the law, so they would have to go to the people. They made their way down from the mountains, traveling under the cover of a storm that had rolled in. They didn't go back to his ranch or to Tombstone. They went to the small, forgotten mining town of Bisbee, a place Slade hadn't bothered to buy yet, a town full of men who had been chewed up and spat out by powerful people their whole lives. He walked into the town's only saloon, the ledger in his hands. Elara stood behind him, her presence a silent testament to the truth of his words. He threw the ledger down on the bar. It landed with a loud thud that silenced the entire room. My name is Will Morgan, he announced, his voice ringing with an authority he didn't know he had. And this book is the reason your claims are running dry, why your friends are disappearing, and why a man named Jericho Slade is getting rich while you starve. He opened the book, and he started to read. He read the names of the ranchers Slade had burned out. He read the details of the bribes paid to the sheriff and the judge. He read the cold, calculated accounting of an empire built on fear and blood. At first, the men were silent, skeptical. But then, as he read, they started to recognize the names. They started to nod. A man stood up, saying the date Will read corresponded to the day his brother's ranch had mysteriously caught fire. Another man recognized the name of a friend who had vanished without a trace. The spark of doubt grew into a murmur of anger, and then a roar of outrage. These weren't lawmen or politicians. They were simple, hard men who had been pushed too far. By the time he finished, the entire saloon was on its feet, a mob of angry, determined faces. They weren't just miners and prospectors anymore. They were an army, and they were ready to take their valley back. News traveled fast. The fuse Will had lit in Bisbee burned its way across the county. Ranchers and farmers, men who had been too scared to speak up alone, now joined the growing militia. They were armed with hunting rifles, shotguns, and a righteous fury that was more powerful than any of Slade's hired guns. They marched on Tombstone. Slade was waiting for them. He had barricaded the main street, his enforcers positioned on rooftops, the corrupt sheriff and his deputies standing with them. It was going to be a bloodbath. Will and his makeshift army stopped at the edge of town. It was a standoff. Slade himself rode out to meet them, a white flag in his hand, a smug smile on his face. Morgan, he called out, you've made your point, but look at these people. They're farmers, not soldiers. You'll lead them to their deaths. Disband this mob, and I will let you and the girl ride away. No one else has to get hurt. It was a tempting offer, a chance to save lives. But Will looked at the faces of the men behind him. He saw their resolve. He looked at Elara, who stood beside him, her hand resting on the rifle slung over her shoulder. This isn't about us anymore, Slade, Will shouted back. This is about them. Give them back what you stole. Face the justice you deserve. Slade's smile vanished. I am the justice in this valley, he sneered. He turned his horse, and as he rode back to his lines, he dropped the white flag in the dust. The first shot came from a rooftop, and the battle for Tombstone began. It wasn't a battle, it was a brawl, a chaotic, desperate fight in the streets of a town that had become a war zone. Will and his men pushed forward, using wagons and barrels for cover, returning fire against Slade's better-positioned men. Men fell on both sides, the air filled with smoke and the screams of the wounded. Will fought like a man possessed. The quiet rancher was gone, replaced by a grim, determined leader. He moved from cover to cover, directing his men, his pistol bucking in his hand. He saw the sheriff go down, shot by a farmer whose land he had helped Slade steal. He saw deputies throwing down their guns and running. The tide was turning, but Slade's core enforcers, The hardened killers were holding the line from their position at the far end of the street, in front of the bank Slade owned. And then Will saw him. Slade. He wasn't on a rooftop. He was on the ground, using the chaos to make his way toward the stable, a bag of gold in his hand. He was trying to run. Will broke from cover and ran after him, ignoring the bullets zipping past him. He tackled Slade just as he reached the stable doors, sending them both crashing into the dirt. They rolled, grappling, punching. Slade was younger, stronger, but Will was fueled by years of suppressed rage. He landed a solid punch on Slade's jaw, dazing him. Will staggered to his feet, pulling his pistol. He had him. "It's over, Slade." Slade looked up from the ground, blood trickling from his lip. He wasn't looking at Will. He was looking past him. He smiled. "You're right," Slade said. A gunshot exploded behind Will. Pain, white-hot and searing, erupted in his shoulder. He cried out, dropping his gun, and fell to his knees. Standing in the stable doorway, a smoking pistol in his hand, was Caleb. His arm was in a sling, his face a mask of triumphant hatred. "I told you, old man," Caleb growled, walking towards him. "The master always wins." Slade got to his feet, brushing the dust from his coat. A fitting end. The failed hero, brought down by his own foolishness. Kill him. Caleb raised his pistol, aiming it directly at Will's head. Will closed his eyes. He thought of Martha. He thought of the quiet. He had failed. Another gunshot rang out, but it wasn't the one he was expecting. He opened his eyes. Caleb was staring down at his own chest, a look of shocked disbelief on his face. A dark red stain was spreading across his shirt. He looked up, his eyes meeting Will's, and then he crumpled to the ground, dead. Standing behind where Caleb had been, her face pale but her hands steady, was Elara. In her hands she held a small Derringer pistol she must have kept hidden. Slade stared at her, his jaw slack with shock. He had forgotten all about the girl, the bookkeeper, the victim. But she wasn't a victim anymore. She looked at Slade, her eyes burning with a cold fire. "It's over, Jericho." Slade, panicked, lunged for Will's fallen pistol. He never made it. Elara fired again. The shot was clean. Slade staggered back, clutching his chest, a look of utter surprise on his face. He fell backward, his head hitting the dusty street with a final, hollow thud. Silence fell over the street. The fighting stopped. Everyone on both sides stared at the scene. The great Jericho Killian Slade, the untouchable cattle baron, the tyrant of the valley, lay dead in the street, brought down not by a gunslinger or an army, but by the quiet bookkeeper he had tried to erase. Elara dropped the small pistol and ran to Will's side, helping him up, her arm supporting him. The ranchers and miners slowly emerged from their cover, their faces a mixture of awe and relief. They gathered around, looking at the dead men, at the wounded rancher and the brave woman who had saved him. They hadn't just won a battle, they had won their freedom, and justice, for the first time in a long time, hadn't come from a man with a badge. It had come from the people it was meant to protect. The story of Will Morgan and the woman named Elara became a legend in that valley. It wasn't a love story, not in the traditional sense. It was something more, a story of redemption. They rebuilt the ranch, but it wasn't quiet anymore. It was filled with the sounds of neighbors stopping by, of children laughing, of a community that was healing itself. Will never fully recovered the use of his shoulder, but he didn't mind. The physical scar was a reminder that the deeper scars, the ones on the inside, could heal. He had faced the silence and screamed back. Elara never left. She found her peace not in running, but in staying. She planted a garden, the first thing that was truly hers, and filled the house with life. They never talked about what happened in Tombstone. They didn't have to. Some things are understood without words, in the shared glances over a morning coffee, in the comfortable silence of two people who had walked through hell together and come out the other side. Life doesn't always give you a second chance, but sometimes if you're brave enough to face the silence, you can build one for yourself. Now let me ask you a question. What would you do if you found someone broken, left behind by the world? Would you turn away and keep riding? Or would you stop knowing that in saving them, you might just save yourself? If this story reminded you that courage isn't about the absence of fear, but about acting in spite of it, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you believe that sometimes the most important battles are fought by ordinary people who simply refuse to give up, then make sure you subscribe. Because there are a million stories like this out there, just waiting to be told.